get at it later and share it with your colleagues if you feel you want to do that. You'll find it on the website and you'll be given the appropriate location for it later on. So welcome. This is Kepner-Tregoe. This is all about problem solving as usual. Those of you who are used to these sessions know that it's quite okay to just jump in at any time and make a comment if you want to. Equally, send in your chat whenever you'd like to. So let's go on to the first of our slides. Just the usual Kepner-Tregoe advertisement, which I will leave you to look at. This is us. We are 60 this year, celebrated our birthday in May, to be precise. And leaving that and moving swiftly on, let's have a look at the overall picture of a supplier ecosystem and the sorts of things that people typically want from their suppliers when any kind of problem occurs, whether that's a logistic problem, a quality issue, invoicing, relationship, or anything else. Ultimately, what we're looking for from our suppliers is effective action, whatever that means to us. And in order to get there, they're going to, or we are going to want to know that 4 things have happened, or 5 things have happened. The first of those 4 things, you have to have the sense that the supplier actually understands what your concerns and issues are, because if they don't, the chances are you're not going to get what you need. The second, does the solution they're offering to whatever the issue, challenge, or problem was or is meet your need? Part of that may well be that you want some assurance that they have actually found the real cause, and whatever it is, whether it's a computing or IT problem or a quality problem or a logistics problem, has been permanently taken out and you're not going to meet it again in the coming months. And finally, you might want some assurance that they're good at managing risk, because one of the things that often happens to those of you who are involved in IT, and in fact as consumers you probably all are, is that your vendor says to you, well, just install this upgrade and it'll all be fine. And then the upgrade breaks 2 new things. So that may well be an issue. So risk management seems to be important. And even more important than that in some ways is that the supplier involves you appropriately. Now what I mean by that is, if the supplier is asking you to do a whole lot of work that properly should be their effort in resolving your problem, then you might feel a little bit unhappy about it. And lots of the Net Promoter Score failures that we've seen at KT have been just because of that, because the supplier is demanding too much of us as part of the work. So let's just mute her. Okay, let's carry on there. So too much effort from us is often felt to be inappropriate when we want a fast solution and we really don't have the time to go through a load of difficult issues. Let's just make this a little bit bigger for you. I'm going to share the full screen. I'm going to need to ask you a question here and verify that you can in fact see the full screen now I've put it up here. Can somebody just unmute themselves and make sure that you can see what's coming up on screen here? Everybody see the large screen okay? If not, please shout. Okay, we'll carry on. So the next part really involves you in a little bit of discussion. So typically we've seen these 6 complaints about supplier problem solving, and as you read them, I'd like you to send in what are the typical issues you have with supplier problem solving, and either chuck those into the chat box or say them out loud if you prefer to do that. So what are the challenges in solving problems in your supply chain? I'm just looking at the chat box here and seeing what you're all sending in. If any more of you are trying to speak, then bear in mind you are still muted, so you'll need to unmute yourself. Oh, now that's an interesting one from Olympus. Supplier takes trial and error type approach. Okay, that's fairly common. And I'd like to ask you a supplementary question, if you wouldn't mind putting in another chat comment. How many trial and errors does it typically take your suppliers to come up with a solution? Is it 2, 3, 4, many? Okay, and we've got reluctance to accept responsibility. Okay, thank you. Many from Olympus there, many trial and errors. And the reluctance to accept responsibility is, of course, one of the things that we can sometimes influence, because the way we have a complex ecosystem of suppliers, maybe if you're in manufacturing, you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different raw materials going into a given product. You have many components in your production system. And of course, you're trying to get these suppliers to cooperate, but each one of them does not want to have the blame, because there may be a penalty attached to that. They may have to pay, or at the very least, they may find themselves making an expensive modification to either their raw material or a component of the machinery that they supplied you. So either way, there's a big cost if you are found to be responsible for the root cause. Any more comments about issues with suppliers to come in via the chat box? No? Okay. Oh. Let me just check. Was that another one? No, it wasn't. Right. We will, in that case, move on to the next one. So if we have a look at the information supply chain, this is kind of an important thing. Whenever there's a problem, you are absolutely dependent on the quality of the information that moves through your supply chain. Let's just take a simple manufacturing example. And by the way, the questions that are being asked would not necessarily be asked in this order in a sensible environment. But you're driving along in your car and your sun visor is falling off. So you make a complaint. You take it back to your dealer and say, well, you know, I'm not sure I like this very much. I'd like you to replace it or do something about it. So then the dealer asks the manufacturer to send a replacement visor so that we can satisfy the customer. Okay, that's fine. Then what happens is the manufacturer might, if they see too many of these, start saying to the subcontractor, the supply chain, okay, look, we've got too many claims for visors now. And then the next question will be, okay, which component exactly are we talking about that's failing? Because, of course, if we are making these visors, we would like to serve our customers and the end consumer very well, and we need to know some detail in order to solve the problem permanently so that it doesn't come back. And then we're going to need to check those components. And then we come back up the supply chain towards the consumer, and the manufacturer of the vehicle might well say, well, actually, which customers are affected by this? Is it all customers in all areas? Is it certain types of customers? We might even ask which visor at some point. Might be a useful question. You know, is it the driver's side one or is it the passenger side one? Because they're not the same. They have different components in them. Some may well have lights in, some may not have lights in, depending on the model you bought. So which visor starts to become an important question. And if we don't get enough information of the right sort flowing up and down the supply chain in an effective way, then we can get some big problems, but also we can extend the time of our problem solving to the detriment not just of us, the customer, but also, of course, our customers and also the whole of the supply chain, which may be involved in expense. You mentioned trial and error earlier on, and we've got another point in here. Louisa, big monetary claims would be part of this scene. Yeah, everybody loses. If we have inefficient problem solving, everybody up and down the supply chain can lose. And when we're talking about cars, the ultimate loss, of course, is a recall event where we have many millions, sometimes billions of euro being wasted in those kinds of activities. So we don't want all of that. So what is your information supply chain like? How much information do you get from your suppliers? And actually, if you're a supplier, of course, we're all suppliers of something, how much good information do you get from your customers to help you diagnose the fault? So let's talk about that for a moment. And again, using the chat box or call it out. Which gives you greatest trouble, in fact? Is it your customer giving you poor information? Is it your suppliers giving you poor information? Or is it both? Okay, Chris Bennett, both. Yeah, okay, so that's a double whammy. And Louisa, okay. Double whammy. Is it double whammies all round? Okay, incomplete data from both sides. Yeah. So incomplete data. Oh, and interpretation. And that's another thing about data. You know, people sometimes will complain when, in fact, the component or the process is working according to specification, exactly. But for some reason, the customer or the user doesn't like it. We often have in information technology problems the issue that the user doesn't like something. It's not wrong. That's what their company bought, but it's not doing what they want. All right. Yeah, there's an important point here from Chris Bennett, lack of clarity of revised processes. So where we're talking about diagnosing, of course, one of the things we're going to be looking at is changes that somebody made in the supply chain somewhere. And if people are not completely transparent about those process revisions and changes, then it's going to be very hard to track down the root cause up and down the supply chain. So great point there from Chris Bennett. Thank you. So let's have a look at some factors that drive all of this difficulty. Another point there from Chris Bennett, which is insufficient details from OEMs about warranties. Okay. So why don't suppliers actually? Why don't people in general solve problems? And you're going to need to look in 5 areas. And I'm not saying these are the only areas to look in, but these are 5 big areas of concern that we find again and again in clients around problem-solving effectiveness. And when you're doing supplier audits, you do really need to make sure you've covered these 5 areas as deeply as you possibly can. So, culture. Is there a culture of problem-solving? Do people get adequately rewarded for not just solving problems fast, but correctly? Second, are the products and services designed with maintainability in mind? People talked a lot a few years ago in information technology about service-oriented architecture. In other words, designing things that would actually diagnose themselves correctly. And of course, you have many more diagnosis tools in all kinds of production chains than you used to have. But even so, not enough probably. So culture and design are 2 areas of problem-solving effectiveness. Third one is methods. If we have all the way up and down the supply chain some very radically different ways of approaching problems, then of course there'll be confusion, misery, and delay along the way. And then if we go round to the 4th one, organization. How are people organized for problem-solving effectiveness? Are they well organized at all? Is there an end-to-end ownership of problems experienced by you, the customer, in your suppliers, or is that responsibility distributed, which may make it more difficult to get the kind of service that you want? And then last, what are the incentives? Now, we can have positive incentives. In other words, people can be rewarded for solving stuff, but actually you can also have negative incentives. And a typical example of this is if a production operator points out a quality problem on the production line. At the very least, that individual will involve himself or herself in a lot more work to fix it. And in some cases, some organizations tend to shoot the messenger. The person that points out the problem, oh yeah, good point there. Just chucking that one in from Chris Bennett. Let me just open that up so I can see it. Most of the people don't analyze the problem. Human beings are designed to problem as fast as they can and leave the danger zone quickly. And that partly has to do not just with organization, but with incentives. You know, there is an incentive. People are shouted at and told immediately, how fast are you solving it? How fast are you solving it? Do you ever hear senior management shouting, how permanently are you solving it? And Chris makes another good point, which is even that can differ between companies and within sites. So you can have cultural differences, incentive differences, organization differences within your own company, as can your suppliers. So one of the difficulties is it's a complex supply chain and difficult then to get a handle on all of these pieces. But here are 5 areas to look at. Let's have a look at how those 5 areas can cause a certain amount of trouble. Looking first at culture. So here are some cultural barriers. These are not the only ones, and I'm happy to hear some more contributions, as always, from you about the cultural barriers that you see. So overvaluing experience is often a cultural barrier that inhibits problem solving. Now, the thing about experience is you experience what you experience. And if you haven't experienced it before, whatever the problem is, you haven't. But we all have a tendency to try to fit a new problem into the frame of what we've seen before. And sometimes we see a problem that's kind of similar and we say, okay, well, that's the same as we saw before, so we'll try the same solution or remedy. But it isn't the same. So your experience, particularly if it's long, can lead you to make quick judgments about things when maybe you need to do a little bit more investigation. Next, are there any incentives to hide information? As Chris rightly said, you know, we want to leave the danger zone as quickly as possible. If we admit there's a problem, then we have to deal with it. I remember working in a canning plant where the plant management could not understand why the problems always moved around the shifts and why the production variation was so great between shifts, and it was relatively simple. Shift A would find a problem on the production line, they would patch it up in a very quick and not particularly effective way, and then leave it, and it would make the machinery run until the end of the shift, but then shift B would be completely screwed because the problem would come back even worse and they would then have to fix it properly. So then by the time the shift A comes back again in a few days' time, what happens is that their other shifts have fixed the problems that they really should have fixed, and they have a nice easy run. So there's always been that kind of thing going on, and we've got a lovely point here. Japanese companies tend to be very conservative. Approach can be slow. Okay. Minimum info. Anyway, there are some incentives to hide information in many organizations. People are not always rewarded for being transparent. And the big barrier, of course, there are contractual penalties for exceptions. So those exist not just between buyer and supplier, but also within organizations. There can be SLA penalties inside the organization where the money is shifted around. And last but not least, an emphasis of speed over quality. And that's not to say we want slow problem solving, but we want people to think about the quality of their problem solving, which will then lead to speed. But there's the saying in English, more haste less speed. In other words, the more you rush at this, the slower it gets, because you find yourself making mistakes and going into trial and error mode, which nobody wants, of course. So that's one of the 5. So that was culture being a barrier, but then we also have a question about methods. And this may be unduly cynical, but I've seen it again, again and again. This is what people often do. First thing we want to do is point fingers. There's something here that you can do with your organization right now. If you look inside your own problem-solving templates, your 8D forms, your 5Y forms, any other reporting you have, and also look into your key suppliers. If the box for who is near the top, you're in danger, because people start focusing on people and not on the essential data that's required for problem solving. So there's a quick tip straight away: take who out of the frame. Put it on page 2. If you really want to know who was involved, put it on page 2. Don't put it near the top. But the essential thing about methods is that you need to have a genuinely shared method and not simply a grudging compliance to some form that you impose upon your suppliers. Let's just check with everybody. How much of your company problem-solving methods do you genuinely share? So for those of you in heavy manufacturing, some of you are using 8D, some of you are using other methods, some of you are Lean and Six Sigma shops, I'm sure. How much of your methodology are you really able to share with your suppliers? And how much have they really adopted? So please shout out or throw something into the chat box. So the question was, how much of your methods are really shared up and down the supply chain? Oh, yep, okay. We're virtual, so we rely on our suppliers, absolutely. Okay, shared, yes, but really adopted, no. Okay. So interesting comments there. Let's quickly move on then to the organization and what happens with organizations. Okay, there's an interesting comment before we move on. Try hard to share 8D learning points between sites making similar products. Yeah, good, good. Let's talk about, whoops, have I skipped one there? Organization. So organization for problem-solving effectiveness. So in any organization, you're going to have problem-solving handled by many different people. So you will have a quality department that collects some data, particularly quality statistics. You will have production departments that will have data about processes and process changes, small and large. You will have, of course, you, the customer, have information about exactly what symptoms you saw when you were using the products, raw materials, or processes. And there may be another point where the customer's customer, so sometimes you may well have a report from a consumer that's then given to a sales organization who gives it to a distributor who gives it back to you, and so you already have a disconnect. So disconnects between the people who have the information and are responsible for the investigation can happen. Equally, we can often have SMEs or subject matter experts very busy doing something else. So the people that designed the process, system, or function are going to be able to help you, but they have a lot of other things to do. They're designing the next one and may not be available just when you need them. And I guess the most important thing about organization is often there is not an end-to-end responsibility for your specific problem, so that when you call up your service desk or your support line, you'll talk to somebody and they'll take your information and they may or may not be able to help you, and if they can't, they'll pass it to someone else. And then the first disconnect happens because the new person who has more skill and experience, maybe more detailed knowledge, then re-asks the same questions. So you get a little bit upset about that, but she is not able to help you either because it's a more complex problem than they've experienced, and then they pass it on to the top expert, who then asks you the same questions a third time. So there's a set of disconnects there that need to be handled. Let's look then at designing for maintainability. This is something that you will all have seen on the right-hand side here. Various varieties of blue screen that say your PC ran into a problem and it's going to restart whether you like it or not. And they say they're collecting some error info, and then we'll restart it for you. But the same error happens again and again and again, and God bless Microsoft and all the other software vendors, somehow it never gets fixed. So there's an interesting thing. So how much proper information is collected by the diagnostic tools? And of course we are limited because it's only if a customer reports a particular symptom that we, the manufacturer, are then prompted to build a diagnostic into our system or our product or process to say, okay, we want to collect this information automatically in future, and that diagnostic routine has to be built into the existing systems or products, and they may not be able to take it because they're older models. Particularly though, we're interested in things like what events just happened before the problem started and getting some exact timestamps. And if we don't get that kind of information, it's very hard for us as manufacturers to troubleshoot, and it's of course hard for our suppliers to troubleshoot if they are not able to get that information from us, which is why we want products designed to collect data automatically. Right, incentives. The incentives problem is a big one. You know what? It's always easier to blame the others. If you have a complex process, it's always easier for the manufacturer of the machine to blame the manufacturer of the raw material. It's always easier for the manufacturer of the raw material to blame your production operators for not setting up the system properly when the product quality is not right. So we just point to everybody else, as we saw on the earlier slide. Service level agreements and penalties often drive unpleasant behavior in suppliers. We often create our own problem with suppliers by caning them very hard. And again, in the IT space, many of you will be involved in outsourcing and buying services from the cloud, and you will have a service level agreement that says something has to be fixed within 2 hours or 1 hour or 30 minutes or whatever it is. And that's great, except that what then happens is if it's not so, there is a penalty. So now our supplier has even less money with which to service. So we've penalized them. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to maybe, you won't like this, but it happens, they're going to maybe take some of their support operation away because they can't afford them, because we've taken away their money. So they can't afford to have all these people. So we're now squeezing them, and they're squeezed, and they're able to provide even less of a service. So they miss the SLA again. So then we penalize them again, and they have even less money to get good people. So sometimes the construction of the contracts actually makes people worse. And of course, when we focus only on speed rather than effectiveness in our contracts, then you know what? We get speed, and it's not necessarily right. So maybe you want to think about, oh, there's an interesting question. Christian Gallardo, thank you very much for that. How many different metrics in average are really needed in an SLA agreement, for instance, to characterize the performance of the supplier? Oh, that's a good one. And I'm going to give you an answer to that, those of you who are interested. Often it's as few as 2. In my experience, it's never more than 5. And of the 5, if you have 5, at least 2 of them must be quality metrics. So rather than how fast did we fix it, maybe we should measure how well did we fix it in terms of, does it happen again? So if it happens again, we know it wasn't fixed, therefore that was a bad quality fix. So interesting stuff about how you decide to do contracts with people, because sometimes the SLAs and the penalties will drive the bad behavior. So let's move on though from that rather difficult set of pictures, and in the second half of this webcast, let's talk about how we can really do it well. So 3 general principles. Those of you familiar with Agile development and the Agile Manifesto in Information Technology will recognize some of this. Nothing is new in the world, but 3 things that we see that will contribute to a good problem-solving supply chain. So first is amplified feedback loops. In other words, how quickly do you give feedback and how effectively do you give feedback to your suppliers to enable them to improve? Second is building a culture of investigation, both in your own organization but also by extension in your suppliers. And third, holistic thinking. In other words, consider the entire system. Many of you will be familiar with Eliyahu Goldratt's The Goal, and that's a great example of considering the entire system, because sometimes what we do is we solve a problem in one area, we remove one bottleneck and we simply shift the bottleneck somewhere else and haven't actually achieved anything. So one of the things that we'll need to do with suppliers is generally share communication about goals, problems, decisions, risks, and performance. I mean, I reference KT Clear Thinking about this, and if you want to look that up on the website, there are lots of articles and webcasts apart from this one that you can find on that topic. But let's have a look at these 3 things. So if you have a look at a problem-solving chain over on the right, it starts with there being some kind of issue or some request or need, or maybe there's a fault. And then an important step is for us, but also our supplier, to clarify exactly what the impact is. If we share with them information in detail about what the impact is on our production process, on our service process, on our business, then they can serve us better. Third thing is manage that impact. And often the impact is managed by a workaround or a temporary fix, just to make sure that we can keep going. If we've had late deliveries or logistic problems, we might get some emergency supplies as a temporary fix. If we have slow computing processes, we might be given additional server power in order to speed that up a little bit, although not fix it permanently. There will be something that can be done to manage the impact. Then if we want a permanent fix, we will need to do 2 things. First of all, describe the problem really accurately, and then something that feeds forward from that is finding the cause. Finding the cause is absolutely dependent on making sure that we've described the problem accurately. And then last but not least, correct the root of the cause, not just the symptoms, whatever way is effective for your organization. So if you think about your process steps in getting your problem solved, they might be like this, or they might be something similar. You might have 3, 4, or 5, you might have 6 or 7 process steps that are important for you. And then, if it's not this list, it's your own boxes, go to the suppliers and start to talk about what are the quality standards for information flow. So if an issue is raised or a fault is raised, what will you give to the supplier about that, and what would they like from you? What's the quality standard for the information in that first blue box? because if you give good quality information, you are likely to get better quality treatment. You know, it is one of those things. When you go to the doctor and they ask you the questions about your illness, if you lie to the doctor, you may not get the treatment that you want. And we all lie to our doctors. One of my doctor friends said that people typically, when they go to the doctor, they will be asked about drinking and smoking and stuff like that. And everybody lies, and everybody underscores the amount of alcohol they consume by at least 50%. Now, that may not matter for your particular illness, but for some illnesses it for sure does. So it's important for us not to give any information that has any potential to mislead our supply chain, because they may then offer us a solution that is wholly inappropriate. And we do it all the time, not necessarily deliberately. So look at your process flow, identify if it's not these 6 boxes, what are your 4, 5, 6 boxes of important problem-solving process steps, and then for each box have a word with the suppliers and say, right, what information do you want from us? What information do we want from you about what's going on in these boxes? Having done that, we need to be providing some immediate feedback. So if you're saying to a supplier, right, what we want is a quality of cause finding where you declare to us your full list of possible causes, all of them, all 17 possible causes, we want you to write down. And what we want you to do is also tell us how you have managed to eliminate 16 of those possible causes for consideration. And third point, how have you tested that the one that you say is the cause and that you will correct is in fact true? Now, that's a big ask. I'm being very demanding here of my supplier. I'm saying I want the full list of possible causes, I want the methods by which you've eliminated, and I want the methods by which you've confirmed the one that you say it is. So if I see then a vague description of possible cause, what I need to do is immediately go back the same hour preferably and say, look, you've said that the possible cause is the cross-dihedral flange, but unfortunately you have not said what you think is wrong with it. You've also not said anything about any other possible causes and how you've taken those out of consideration. So we need to give that immediate feedback loop to suppliers. Conversely, if they are doing really well, I mean, I had a nice note this morning from a customer in India congratulating me on the feedback that I'd given them about their problem solving, which is kind of ridiculous, really, in a way, but all the same, it was nice to know that what I'd given them was helpful. And unfortunately, there is not enough positive feedback in the world. And one of the things, there was a book written a little while ago, at least in English, and some of you may have bought it. It was called How to Train Your Husband. It's a book for women, but it could also be a book for men. But it was How to Train Your Husband. And it was really saying, we're like dogs, you know. We need a biscuit or a chocolate or some positive feedback to make us do those good things again. And so it's important to make sure that if the supplier is doing something specific right, we make sure they know that so that they carry on doing it. And also, when they are giving us good quality information, show them how that specific information will help. So there's an interesting thing coming out here. What channels do you recommend feedback? Many people use the conversation and people are careful not to compromise with an answer. I prefer a phone call. Is there a better way? I think the feedback is best done within whatever framework you're using. So if you're using 8D, for example, and you have a standard set of forms you've agreed with your supplier, then I would actually put in a comment to the specific piece of information I want to call out and say, look, this is really helpful. So whatever you're already using, use that as your feedback place. Put the feedback in the same place as the original information exists. And I know there's some danger in making comments in writing, but it can help. The other thing that quite often helps is to make sure that if individuals are particularly helpful, we do always copy the management team that's behind them to make sure that that management team is aware that we like this particular kind of behavior, and they go on encouraging their staff to behave in this way. So let's move on to something that's important to us at KT. Those of you who've been on KT classes will recognize all this, and I'm sorry if it's a little repeat for some of you, but there are 4 things that generally need to get done in investigations. First of all, the supplier needs to understand what are our important issues. We need to discuss how cause is going to be found. We need to discuss what solutions are available from that supplier and be a participant in the parameters that that solution should satisfy. And we also need to discuss the risks of whatever the proposed solution is, because we don't want to change the process and then find we create 2 new problems. So those 4 questions are fundamental, and if you get those right, with clear information given to the supplier, then that's really helpful. And we can do this on a personal level too. If you tell your supplier precisely what's wrong with your vehicle, what kind of noise it's making, under what circumstances it makes that noise, the times of day it makes that noise, the speed at which the noise occurs when you're going on, is it a consistent one? If you give them a reasonably high level of detail, they are much more likely to be able to narrow down the cause, where if you just take your car into the dealership and say, look, it rattles, please fix it, it's going to be difficult for them to do that and take more time consuming, and they are likely to do a lot more trial and error at your cost. So as we move on, let's have a look at effective methods. We all have templates we like. And one of the things about templates is the bigger the templates are, and there's an example down the bottom here of a version of 8D. Some of you use A3. Some of you use other templates. The bigger and nastier the template is, the more likely it is that people don't do it properly. I've just had an example where it was mandated that a certain part of a template was filled in, and according to the statistics, every employee was filling in this part of the template correctly. But unfortunately, the only check that was made was on the statistics. So this is an electronic database, and we know that field has been filled in. Unfortunately, in almost every case, it has a full stop in it and nothing else. So people are just putting the dot in so that the system recognizes they've put something in the box. And many of you will have seen similar behavior. So we also need to make quality checks. To get this right then is to have a conversation with the supply chain about what absolutely is the essential data for diagnosis. And let's not be asking people to write down stuff that is not going to contribute to the diagnosis. And it really does help to involve the whole information chain to agree what checklist is going to work for you. Specifically, ask what data helps you, dear supplier, to establish cause, and show what data that you can collect as a customer to allow that supplier to serve you better. And don't make your template any bigger than that. Short is good. And you know what? It may well be you try to have a really short template for a bit and then you find you have to change it. Okay, so you do. None of these things are durable. Circumstances will change, methods will change, your template will change in response to that. And here is an example of a relatively simple template. I am not by any means recommending you adopt this, but what we're doing is looking at 4 things. In the blue area, what happened and what's our action plan? In the green area, what are our alternative solutions? In the yellow area, we'll describe any risks we can see. and in the red area we have the problem investigation. Thank you, Chris. Nothing beats KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. And for some customers, even this kind of form is more complicated than they need. But one thing that we've noticed at KT for the last 60 years is what helps is to have a separate box for the overview and the issues, a separate box for the possible solutions, a separate box for the risks, and a fourth box for the investigation information. Keeping those four colors separate, those of you who've been on to one of our problem solving classes will have heard this before, appears to aid the quality but also the speed of problem solving. Don't mix those things up if you possibly can in your form. So this often prompts some questions. So please, by all means, unmute yourself and ask questions about this if you'd like to. We have still 12 minutes available of our allotted time. So if you want to chat about this particular form, I'm happy to do that.
Andrew, this is Sean Lewington. Can you
Yep.
explain that again? What you said you shouldn't separate. Oh, sorry, you should separate. Sorry,
You
I didn't
should
get that.
separate. You should separate the discussion and information, which is about understanding the issues and the impact on the customer, blue,
Okay.
from what are our alternative solutions, green,
Yes.
what are the risks, yellow, and the investigation of the cause, red.
Okay.
And it appears that doing that, particularly for very large-scale incidents, will cut the time by about half.
Okay. No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions, anyone? So anybody who wants to get into the whole business of form and template design, we sell an excellent service for this purpose, but actually that's not the point of this webcast, so we're not going to do that right now. So in that case, let me move on to organization models, which you might like to audit. So by all means, audit your suppliers' templates and see if they're doing the thing that you want them to do, but try and harmonize as far as you can up and down the supply chain what information you are collecting and sharing. So moving on to organization models. What organization models would best serve you from the point of view of being the customer asking the suppliers to serve you well? And there are many ways in which people organize their support functions and their service functions. But if you have a look at three, one model is that the subject matter experts design and build the components, and they will actually support those components. One of the difficulties is that subject matter experts are few and far between, and while they are brilliant at knowing the answers, they're not always available when you need them to be available. If you are in a staggeringly high-tech environment, you will probably want to get to the subject matter experts as early as possible in the cycle of your specific problem. Second model, you have a dedicated support team. You have a service desk somewhere, you have technical support engineers department who are sitting there waiting for calls, waiting for emails, looking at web forms, also looking at the remote diagnostic data. And that dedicated support team will always be able to respond fast. In good organizations, you will have 2, 3, 4 rings in response time. You will have response time to emails of less than a minute. All those things are very good. However, it may well be that for your individual problem, that support team lacks deep knowledge. And then there's the third, which is the hybrid. And one of the more interesting hybrids is where the SMEs rotate into the support team. So That's where you have a support desk, a technical support department, but the designers and the real product gurus will always spend a day a week actually on the phones, on the emails, on the desk, hearing what it's like at the sharp end. Now, the SMEs are still not always available to you when you want them, but at least they are more likely to be there. Now, there are other models as well. You can come up with lots of models of organization for support, but the question that's worth asking when you work with suppliers, and particularly when you contract new suppliers, is what is their model and how closely does it fit your needs? And if it doesn't, demand what you want. Now, I know you can't always do that, and if we are a relatively small organization and we're looking up at Oracle or SAP or Microsoft and saying your organization model, support model doesn't suit us, well, you're not going to get very far. But where you do have power, it may be worth considering working with the supply chain and saying, well, is there a different kind of support organization that will serve us all better? So as we get to the end of this, we've got one more thing to try and work on, and that's a way to look at the culture of the suppliers that you work with. And this is a model called the performance system, and you will find some mention of it in your problem solving and decision making manual if you've been on that class, also in your resolve manual if you've been on that class. But we are all part of multiple performance systems, and any individual or department has a bunch of performers in the middle of it doing some good things, and the question about those is, have they the competencies that are required to provide the level of support they need to for us, the customer? So you need to ask, is there a clear view of competencies in your supply organization? If there is, all well and good, fine. Second, how does your supply organization measure the performance of its people? Do you think the performance measures those folks are targeted by really fits your needs? So if your supply chain is not measuring their people in a way that helps you to get good quality product and good quality problem solving, well, you know what? You may need to have a discussion about that. Third, consequences. Consequences is Katie's jargon for rewards, but not just tangible rewards, the intangible things. What do people get thanked for? What do people get recognized for? What do people get criticized for? So negative consequences. Are we giving people recognition for the right things? Specifically, fixing problems durably first time and with a degree of efficiency in working with the customer, that's us. And I talked about giving effective feedback to suppliers, but do suppliers give effective feedback to their own people? Are we seeing a supplier that is reinforcing good behaviors in its support organization? Or are we seeing a supplier that chases the support organization to close each problem quickly? If they do that, they're not going to serve you well. And last but not least, do they have the right working environment, tools and software? If they've got a really crappy support tool, I could name a few, but I'm not going to for fear of getting sued, then those people are not serving you well. And also, what is the list of performance expectations? This is a great thing to do. Go to your supply chain, look at the technical support operation, and say to them, I'd like to see the list of performance expectations you give your staff, please. Woohoo! And if it's not a set that you really like the look of, you may want to have a deeper, meaningful discussion. There's a lot of trouble. People in general always try to come to work to do a great job for you, the customer. But the best, brightest, cleverest, most motivated person will be beaten down by an unpleasant performance environment. So you need to have a look at that performance environment and that culture, and if it's not right, you may maybe choose not to work with that supplier at all. So as we get to the final minutes, Three things you might want to try on top of all the other things I've been talking about so far, particularly related to problem solving. Ask your suppliers, how easy is it for your employees to report a non-conformance, small or large? If it's not easy, it's not going to happen. So little problems will become bigger and they will impact your quality of supply. Second, find out what exactly happens when a customer reports a defect. Trace that defect all the way back through the supply chain, through your direct supplier, through their suppliers, and see what happens to it. You may well be shocked. And again, there'll be some action you might want to take. And then specifically for suppliers, if we want quality problem solving, you want a quality measure. So, are the descriptions of the problems that they record complete and clear? Are the descriptions of the causes complete and clear? Is there a clear link between the solution that's proposed and the cause that has been found? Those are three things that are non-numeric measures where people actually have to read the data and understand whether it's being done well. Ask the question, what non-numeric measures have you of problem-solving effectiveness? We've got a few minutes left and I'm quite happy to stay on the line and chat about any of this if you'd like to, but we're coming to the end of our formal time, so this is where I'm going to turn the recorder off. So at this point, if you ask a question, it won't